Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today we are taking a look at a Guardian tactical knife. This is the Patron. Now, this is the Patron. However, if you want to buy this same model, it seems that since this one was produced, they have had a name change, and so the knife is now known as the Deltrix. I don't know why the name change, but it just seems to be that that's the case. So if you want one of these, if you think this is the greatest knife you've ever seen and you want to go out and buy one, you need to look for that rather than the Patron, unless you find, one listed somewhere that's an older model that still has this original name. I have no idea why they changed the name. You can see that this one was made in 2014, so sometime between 14 and 17. Obviously, they've decided to call it something else. I guess a rose by any other name though, right? So, want to thank Scott or Real Bush Monkey EDC for sending this along, and he's actually going to have a lot to do with this video because not only am I going to share this knife, which is his, but I've got a bunch of knives of his for comparison with it as well. By the way, one last thing by way of introduction, if you think that this looks like a Microtech, well, you should know that the guys who started Guardian Tactical came from Microtech. In fact, one of the guys was their lead designer. So it makes sense that there's a little bit of carryover in terms of the look of this. Last thing, this is a G10 handled knife. And nowadays, if you go to look up the Deltrix, like I was saying a second ago, you'll find that it's in carbon fiber. And as far as I know, there's no more, you can't go and buy, they're not making new G10 versions of this. There's nothing indicating that it's a G10's available either on the website or at any of the retailers I was able to check, unless again you happen to find an older one made around the same time as this one in 2014. All right, so let's go ahead with size, weight, and how comfortable this guy is to carry in your pocket. I'll apologize in advance. I do have a bit of a cold still. Hopefully it goes away soon. Someone was commenting, I hope your cold goes away soon. And I'm like, you hope it goes away? Yeah, I kind of hope so too, okay? So overall size on this guy is almost 9 inches. So we've got 8 and 15 sixteenths, 3 3/4 of an inch blade. And notice how the handle kind of keeps going up. So I measured from right here, just behind the thumb stud or stop pin here, and that's where I took my overall length from. Obviously you can see that it continues to go up another, 1/16 of an inch or so. So it's gonna be a little bit of variation there depending on where you measure from. All right, and the number I got again was 3 3/4. Finally, close this down. The other thing is that won't add up, right? If you try to add up the handle length and the blade length to get 8 and 15 sixteenths, you won't get it, and that's because there's a bit of a variation there. So the other number that matters here is 5 3/8, and that is the closed length. By the way, this is almost 5/8 of an inch thick. Actually, I think it is 5/8 of an inch thick, so it's a fairly wide handle that we're dealing with. And the weight on this guy is a pretty hefty 5.9 ounces. So this is a big knife and it is fairly weighty. A little surprising given the full G10 construction, but probably a lot of that weight, well, a good amount of weight is coming from the blade, of course, and then there's also this backspacer as well that's going to add some extra heft to the knife. So, excuse me there, guys. The blade on this guy is CPM 154, which is the powdered metallurgy version of 154 CM. Very, very nice steel. We've got this sort of Wharncliffe-ish style of blade, or reverse Tanto style of blade with a compound grind. This one, of course, has the black DLC coating, but they don't all have it. So you can get this blade. I don't know that you can get it all satin, but you can at least get the satin on the primary bevels there, and then the black is going to be still here on the flats, which I do think looks pretty sharp. In terms of the performance of this blade, I've actually been pretty happy with it. CPM 154 is a very high performance steel, so that's definitely going to work well. This compound grind, there's something I want to say about this, and that is, to me, it's a little bit backwards. Okay, generally, I would expect the hollow grind to be here at the base and the flat grind to be out toward the tip, adding some extra strength to this tip so that it doesn't break off if you're prying or if you're stabbing something really hard. In this case, they've got the hollow grind at the end, making this a very, very fine point. I will say this, if you're doing any kind of fine work like this, which does work really well, notice this sort of fuller, the pattern in these fullers, it does actually give you quite a bit of tactile ability, so you can really get a hold of this blade and do some really fine work with that tip, which is actually kind of appreciated. The fullers are definitely decorative. I don't know how I feel about them. They kind of add an interesting detail to the knife, but they're certainly not necessary. I guess maybe they reduce the weight a little bit, but it's still almost 6 ounces, so even that isn't doing a whole lot for you. The one use I will say they do seem to have is if you want to open the knife slowly, you can sort of get your finger into those fullers and be able to open the knife that way, which is kind of interesting. If you open it with the thumb stud, I know we're kind of talking about action now, but if you open it with the thumb stud, it kind of flies open a little faster. So maybe you want to open it slow and you use the fullers for that purpose. Now, in actual use, I found this knife quite nice. So the issues that I have in terms of, the hollow grind here and that, that's really only a theoretical issue. When I'm actually using the knife, I haven't had any problems with it. And I've used it to cut all kinds of things. I've done some like wood carving. I've cut some, paracord and stuff like that. Even cut up some cheese and some fruit. And by the way, none of that cheese or fruit or anything got into those fullers. So I know some guys will talk about the fuller creating an issue that way. It just hasn't been my experience. So moving on from the blade, which I do like. I think this blade is pretty well done. It's a useful shape. It's nice and thin behind the edge, so no complaints about the blade, other than the fact that I think this is a little bit backwards. Let's move on to lockup and deployment. And this is a very, very smooth knife. Let's say that right away. It is a bearing pivot. Not a flipper, which is kind of interesting to see. It feels like every higher end knife has got to have a flipper on it, and this one doesn't, but it does deploy quite quickly and quite nicely. The thumb stud is also forming the stop pin here. We see that lots of times. We see that with the Microtech DOC, and they have done something. They've taken another sort of play out of the Microtech playbook, and you can see how the metal liner comes up and comes up to the face of this handle, so that when those thumb studs, now stop pins, contact the handle, they're contacting metal rather than G10, and so you're going to get better wear over time with that. Now that does mean that when the knife is closed, there's no stop pin up here, and these are not obviously stopping it. So what stops it? Well, there's an internal stop pin right back here. You can see it at the tip of my finger. All right, so that's how that works. I will say, I feel like they have pulled this off better than anybody else I've seen. Striders have that internal stop pin, so did the Benchmade 928. And on those knives, it was a real pain in the neck because they had this extra cutout here to accommodate the stop pin. So in addition to this finger choil, imagine if there was another choil now. That's how those other two companies did it, and I think that was absolutely stupid, and it made the knife look really stupid. This is much better implemented, okay? So lockup and deployment, overall quite good. Let's just talk a little bit about that lock bar before we leave that alone. So you can see what they've done here is you've got a piece of G10 and they've bolted a piece of steel to form the lock bar into the G10. It's actually being held on by the screws that are going here into the clip. And then in addition to that, they've covered that with another piece of milled G10 right here. So kind of an interesting choice. It seems strange that they didn't just make this, kind of one piece of metal, sort of like a sub frame lock. We're all used to seeing that. But I guess for stylistic reasons, they decided to go this way. And it's not the end of the world. I'm not really complaining about it. It just is not what we're used to seeing. And so it kind of strikes the eye in funny ways. You're examining this knife, you're like, did they put a piece of G10 over the metal? And you go, yeah, they did. And so it can make you go, that seems odd, but it works just fine, and it does make the knife very comfortable in hand. And so maybe the choice was made to do that because of that extra comfort that it affords. Overall, basically this is a liner lock knife or a frame lock knife, depending on how you want to call it. Just don't call it a sub frame lock because Kershaw will be mad at you. Okay, so that's lockup and deployment. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the handle, which again is fairly well done. We've got this heavily machined G10, very comfortable in hand, jimping in all the right places. There's one little hot spot here. It goes away if I do this, but back here in a saber grip, let me grip this really hard and then I'll show you what's happening. Okay, there we go. You should be able to see. Yeah, see right here, the end of that pocket clip is getting me pretty good in the hand there. So it's not horrible, right? It doesn't make the knife unusable or anything like that, but it's just not as comfortable as it could be. I wish they'd kind of flattened this out or done something a little bit different with it. And of course, you know, the same is true of the Microtech DOC. You recall it was even much, much worse than this. Single position clip. You can see you've got G10 and then a stainless steel backspacer here. Fairly small lanyard hole. You might get 550 cord through there. Especially, you know, if you gutted it, you probably could, but it wouldn't be easy. All right, single position clip, which we've talked about, and it is not a deep carry clip. Check out how much of this knife is going to be out of your pocket when you're carrying it. So that's a fair bit. All right, and if that's an issue for you, this may be a knife that you'd want to avoid. Oh, you know what I didn't mention? Since we're talking about construction, notice that these are proprietary screws and they are annoyingly proprietary. This looks like nothing I've ever seen before. Like they took the screws out of an alien spacecraft and stuck them in here so that no one could ever take the knife apart. Back here you do have regular Torx screws, which makes that even a little bit more frustrating because you go, I could take all these out and I still would be stuck with this silly thing. Not the end of the world. As I say, this knife, it has definitely been used and carried quite a bit, as you can kind of see just from the overall look of it, but it works just fine. So maybe they've built this so well that it just doesn't need to be taken down for maintenance all that much. And you know, certainly I've been pretty impressed with it. So it is what it is. Let's see, is there anything I forgot to... Oh yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting. Check out the backspacer. Look at the groove that's been cut in the backspacer there and there. That's to accommodate the blade as it closes so that it doesn't bang into the backspacer. My thinking on that would be, if your blade was about to bang into the backspacer, wouldn't it make more sense to just mill it even thinner rather than cut a groove into it? It seems like another machining process that would be unnecessary if you had just, you know, not just made it a little bit thinner in the first place. But that's the way they chose to go. Again, it's not the end of the world, and I certainly am not complaining about it because it works just fine. It just feels like maybe extra intricacy or extra work that doesn't necessarily have to be there. Let's go ahead with some comparisons, and as I say, I've got some of Real Bush Monkey EDC knives here with me. By the way, if you're not following him on Instagram, you probably want to do that. He's got a pretty cool Instagram feed. First knife that I've got to share with you is going to be the Lion Steel SR11. I feel like these are in a similar vein, okay? Both high-end, hard-use knives. Meant for sort of EDC plus, okay? Meant for not just opening packages or cutting a piece of rope now and then, but for slightly more onerous tasks. Both of these kind of, I think, fit that role. I want to say, now I don't know for sure because of course I can't go back in time and find out what this knife originally sold for. I'm going to say this one is a bit more expensive. Certainly now, the carbon fiber version is a fair bit more expensive than the Lion Steel. The carbon fiber version I think goes for $299. And then again, that puts it in a weird place. So I'm going to bring in some other knives as well. Here is my Riot Torrent, which I absolutely love. Again, you know, this guy retails for I think $350 or so, which is going to be a little bit more than the carbon fiber version of this knife, but very similar vein. You know, it's a very hard use, well-built tool that's also very refined, and it kind of pulls these two worlds together, this world of beauty and refinement as well as being, you know, overbuilt, tough, and practical. And so both of these knives I feel like kind of fall into that vein. Along those lines, let's pull in the XM18 really quickly for two reasons. Number one, again, you've got these two fairly hard use knives. These are meant to be well used and confidence inspiring knives, but you've also got a knife that's very familiar to people. So this gives you a good idea of size. And since we're doing that, let's grab a pair of two really quickly. So there it is beside a pair of two, and oh yeah, I do have it here. Manix 2 lockback as well. Okay, even a little bit smaller than the pair of two. A couple more knives that I think are very comparable. Certainly this knife is very compelling. If you really like this, this has got to be a consideration for you. Now this is heavier by at least 1 ounce, like this is 7 ounces or so. So that's pretty hefty. But again, you've got a G10 liner lock, really nice steel. Certainly some similarities between the Zero Tolerance 0909 and this guy. The styling on this is going to be obviously a little more dramatic, okay? And what else have I got? Oh yeah, here is the Lion Steel Big Degata. Again, kind of in a similar vein, you know, a refined, nicely made knife, but it's really meant for some pretty hard use purposes. Very, you know, the choices on this knife, again, like this knife, are pretty hard use, meant to be used and abused kind of construction. Okay, and of course this is G10 as well. Different kind of lock on this guy, but I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail because this is not a review of this, it's a review of this. But again, a comparable knife, probably in a similar price point as well. Perhaps the closest in price to the knives that I shared with you today. I don't have my Cold Steel Recon 1, but this is a knife I think that begs to be compared to the Recon 1. I mean, you've got G10 and, you know, an all black knife, and they just, you know, sort of a tactical hard use type of knife, and I just feel like they ought to be compared, but it's at home on the shelf, so I can't do that for you. All right, so those are the comparisons I've got. Let's move on to my overall conclusion, and my conclusion is this, guys. This is a well-built knife. The things that it's supposed to do, it definitely does, right? It cuts stuff, it opens quickly and nicely, it's comfortable in hand, it holds an edge, you know, all the things that we want a high-end knife to do. It's got that nice drop shut action. It looks really cool. So all the things that a knife is supposed to do, this does, and it does them pretty well. The thing is, the look of this is going to be something that you either love or you hate. Some people are going to look at this knife and say, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I, you know, although I wouldn't go quite that far, I will say I find this knife pretty darn attractive. Some others are going to look at this knife and go, why would anyone want that? And I think that's true of any knife that's very distinctive in its styling, which this certainly is. So here's how I would say this. If you look at this knife and you think that is amazing, that is the most beautiful knife I've ever seen, well then I don't think you'll be disappointed by its quality or its function if you buy one. So I think you would definitely be very, very happy, and it's absolutely a cool knife. On the other hand, if you look at this and you don't find yourself very compelled by it, if you don't think it's an attractive knife, well then obviously you shouldn't buy it, okay? But I do think it's well built. It's definitely very cool. I like a lot of the, oh, you know what guys, I totally forgot to show you one little thing, and that is right here. This knife has a detent ramp, and I completely forgot to mention it, but I do love that. Really nice little touch, and especially considering this is a few years old before sort of everyone started doing that, great touch. So overall, very high quality, very well done, pretty expensive, but certainly, you know, the attention to detail is there for the money that you're putting out. That's my take on the Guardian Tactical Patron, or what did I call the other one? Deltrix. All right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon.